Drop to your knees and beg forgiveness. Let these candidates see exactly what happens when someone without a trident thinks she deserves to stand among them. The command cracked through the early morning air at the Naval Amphibious Training Grounds in Redwater Bay. Senior Chief Braddock Kane towered over a woman barely half his size, his grip locked around her shoulder as he shoved her toward the concrete while 173 BUD/S candidates stared, unmoving and stunned. Her name was Mara Kelton. She was 31, and the man grinding her face toward the grinder had no clue he was laying hands on someone whose personnel file demanded a polygraph and a congressional briefing just to open. The next 90 seconds would tear apart 2 knee joints, end the careers of 2 instructors, and force Naval Special Warfare Command to admit a truth they had hidden for 5 long years. Yet the real mystery wasn't how she dismantled them, it was why a woman with her background allowed herself to end up in this position at all, and what exactly she'd been sent here to prove. The Pacific fog clung to Redwater Bay like damp shrouds at 0530, turning the notorious concrete courtyard into a muted gray void where sound died mere feet from its source. The grinder, that pitiless slab where generations of men had learned whether they possessed the grit the teams required, sat untouched in the pre-dawn quiet. Dew gathered on the pull-up bars. The ocean growled somewhere inside the haze, unseen but unmistakably there. If you're tuning in from anywhere across the world, this is your story. And if you value the voices of real veterans, hit subscribe and join Major Tom's Tales. Mara Kelton stood at parade rest near the quarterdeck, feet set shoulder width, hands clasped neatly behind her back. She was 5 feet 6 inches, moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who had spent years mastering exactly how much energy each moment demanded and never using more than needed. Her dark blonde hair was secured in a perfect regulation bun. Her face showed nothing, no boredom, no strain, no anticipation, just pure stillness. She wore basic Navy PT gear, black shorts, a gray shirt, worn in running shoes, the same as the candidates. Nothing about her appearance hinted at rank or authority, the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant commander were tucked away in her room. Officially, she was just an observer, a female integration advisor sent by Naval Special Warfare Command to review training protocols. That was the story they chose to tell. On her inner left forearm, usually hidden by her watchband, rested a small tattoo, a black ink balance scale wrapped by a coiled serpent. Outsiders saw nothing special. But to the 63 people alive who understood it, that mark meant she had survived the selection for a program the government insisted did not exist. 30 feet away, Commander Julian Reddick watched her from beneath the overhang of the HQ building, studying a woman whose file he had read without a single redaction and whose presence here unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He was 51 now, a former SEAL Team 4 platoon commander who served as the executive officer of the Naval Special Warfare Center, and he had read Mara Kelton's service file, the real version, the one so sensitive he'd had to sign 3 separate non-disclosure agreements just to open it. What he knew made the coming hours unsettling, but what he suspected about her true purpose here made his stomach tighten. Mara Kelton learned patience long before she learned how to hurt anyone. Her father, Chief Warrant Officer 3rd Samuel Kelton, had spent 19 years as a Special Forces weapons sergeant with the 5th Group until a training accident at Fort Campbell fused his spine and sent him home with a medical discharge. He returned to their land in the hills of eastern Kentucky with a disability pension, a 7-year-old daughter, and a survival philosophy that would shape every corner of her life. He never taught her to fight, he taught her to be still. By the time Mara was 10, she could hold a deer stand for 9 silent hours without shifting. At 13, she could read terrain the way other kids flipped through comic books, understanding instinctively how water carved paths, where animals sheltered, which routes offered real concealment and which ones only pretended to. At 16, she placed 3rd in the Kentucky State High Power Rifle Championship, competing against adults twice her age. Her father never explained why he trained her like this, he simply said the world always underestimated quiet people, and the quiet ones were usually the most dangerous. She believed him. At 18, Mara enlisted in the Navy. By 22, she'd finished cryptologic technician training and joined Naval Special Warfare Group 2 as an intel support specialist. At 24, she deployed to Jalalabad with a SEAL Team 8 task unit as their primary signals analyst. At 25, everything shifted. A personnel recovery mission in Kunar province had gone sideways, a 4-man recon team compromised and minutes from being overrun. Mara was supposed to stay in the Joint Operations Center, monitoring comms and feeding intelligence, but when the extraction bird was chased off by ground fire, she broke protocol entirely. 3 kilometers from the trap team, she convinced a SWCC chief to let her ride with a ground convoy trying to reach the stranded SEALs from another direction. The convoy was ambushed 2 kilometers out. In the chaos, Mara dragged a wounded operator from a burning vehicle, used her belt as a tourniquet on his femoral artery, and fired an M4 to hold off the attackers while the survivors regrouped. She kept that position for 43 brutal minutes until air support arrived. One of the compromised operators was Lieutenant Rowan Vance. He bled out during the flight to Bagram. His final words to her, shouted over the roar of the engines, were simple: "You think like one of us. You ought to be one of us." Naval Special Warfare agreed. 6 months later, Mara was offered something no woman had ever been offered: a lateral transfer into a classified assessment and selection pipeline built to test whether women could serve in direct action support roles alongside Tier 1 units, not as SEALs, but as a new category of specialists capable of filling gaps men alone couldn't cover. The program had no official name. The 63 who completed it called themselves the Quiet Professionals. Their operational history was buried under layers of classification requiring congressional notification just to skim. For 5 years, Mara Kelton lived in the shadows, deploying to places that didn't exist on travel records, supporting missions no one would ever acknowledge, proving again and again that capability wasn't determined by chromosomes. The tattoo on her forearm, the balance scale twined with a serpent, was earned during a mission in eastern Syria that killed 2 of her teammates and left shrapnel scars across her ribs that still ached when the weather shifted. Now she was in Redwater Bay, officially tasked with evaluating integration protocols for naval special warfare support roles. Unofficially, her purpose was something far sharper and far more dangerous. She was here because someone inside Naval Special Warfare Command suspected that a handful of Redwater Bay instructors were quietly sabotaging the integration effort, and they needed someone who could endure whatever those men tried to throw at her. Rowan Vance had been gone 6 years now, and she carried his memory with her every day. Senior Chief Braddock Kane had spent 13 years shaping civilians into SEALs. At 46, standing 6'1", he looked like a man who never stopped training from the moment he earned his trident. He'd completed 5 combat deployments, earned a Bronze Star with Valor for actions in Ramardy, and mentored over 200 operators who now served across the community. For the past 18 months, though, he'd watched the institution he loved brace for changes he simply couldn't accept. Kane's resistance to integration wasn't just prejudice, though some of that lived beneath the surface. It came from something deeper, a belief forged through years of watching men live or die based on the strength of the person next to them. He had seen teammates fall because someone couldn't carry their weight. He had zipped closed body bags containing friends who might have lived if someone had been stronger, faster, more capable. To him, lowering standards in the name of progress wasn't progress at all. It was setting the stage for casualties. What he couldn't recognize, what experience had never taught him, was that expanding who could meet the standard wasn't the same as lowering it. 173 Phase 1 candidates stood shivering in formation, fog clinging to their clothes after a 4-mile beach run. It was their 4th week, just far enough in to realize how little they understood, but not far enough to be fully broken. Most wouldn't make it to Phase 2. Mara stood at the edge of the formation, clipboard in hand, watching. She'd been introduced 2 days earlier as an advisor evaluating training protocols. Most candidates barely registered her presence. A few gave her quiet looks of disdain. 1 or 2, the detail-oriented ones, noticed the way she moved, the way she observed, the way nothing seemed to catch her off guard. Senior Chief Kane approached with 2 instructors at his sides, Chief Nolan Kerr and PO1 Jace Rowan. Both had served under him for years, and both shared his views on integration. Kane stopped 4 feet from Mara and studied her with open hostility. He told her he understood she was here to observe his training program. He told her he wanted expectations made clear. He told her the grinder was his domain, that its standards were forged in real combat, and he wouldn't let political pressure jeopardize the men who would eventually wear the trident. Mara listened without a hint of emotion. Her breathing stayed calm. She didn't shift an inch. When he finished, she simply said she appreciated his point of view and that she was there only to observe, not interfere. Kane smiled, a smile that had nothing warm behind it. Observation required context, he said. Maybe she should join the morning evolution so she could understand what real training felt like. Maybe it would help inform her recommendations. Several candidates exchanged nervous glances. They had seen instructors target people before and recognized the setup instantly. Mara said she'd be glad to participate. The evolution began with 8-count bodybuilders, a vicious compound movement blending squat thrusts, push-ups, and jumping jacks. The candidates counted in rhythm while instructors stalked the ranks for weakness. Mara matched the pace effortlessly, her form crisp, her breathing steady, every motion controlled as if she'd done this thousands of times in far worse conditions. She'd pushed through this exercise in conditions far worse than a foggy Redwater Bay morning, so the 15 minutes barely touched her. When Kane finally barked a halt, several candidates were shaking, and 3 had already fallen behind the count. Kane then ordered Mara to the front. Since their guest seemed to be doing fine, he announced, she could demonstrate proper technique while the formation recovered. She would continue alone, he added, until he decided her form was good enough. She would stop only when he told her to. Mara stepped forward and began without hesitation. She kept going for 19 uninterrupted minutes. When Kane finally called it, something in his expression shifted, the contempt lingered, but now there was a thin glint of calculation hiding beneath it. He warned her that calisthenics were the easy part, and the real test was still ahead. The visiting officer quarters were silent when Mara returned at 0230. Her assigned room overlooked the Pacific, furnished with a metal bed frame, a bare-bones desk, and a window that rattled whenever the wind pressed against it. She sat on the mattress and studied her hands. The calluses were familiar markers. The small scar on her right thumb came from a survival knife that slipped during training in the North Carolina mountains. The faint bruising across her left knuckles came from a close-quarters fight inside a building near Raqqa, a mission she shouldn't have remembered, but of course she did. Every detail replayed in her mind like an after-action debrief. Kane's psychology was obvious. He was a man whose entire identity rested on a rigid definition of excellence, and her presence threatened everything he believed about who deserved to stand here. His tactics would escalate. His methods would sharpen. Eventually he would force a confrontation so direct that neither of them could pretend anymore. She had seen this pattern before, in other places, with higher stakes, and she had survived it every time. The real question wasn't whether she could endure what was coming. The question was whether enduring it would mean anything, or whether it would simply validate what men like Kane already thought, that women didn't belong here. She rose and walked to the window. The fog had thinned enough to show a shard of moon hanging over the ocean. She thought about Rowan Vance, about the weight of his body as she helped load him into the helicopter, about his fading voice almost swallowed by the engine noise. He'd told her she thought like one of them. He'd told her she should be one of them. He'd been wrong about the second part, she would never be a SEAL. Biology made that absolute. She couldn't meet the exact standards that Pipeline demanded, and she'd never pretended otherwise. But he'd been right about the first part. She understood the operator mindset. She understood what they needed. And she knew the future of naval special warfare required people like her, not replacing SEALs, but filling roles they couldn't. Kane couldn't see that future. His experience had never prepared him for it. Showing him was her job. Her fingers brushed the tattoo on her forearm, the balance scale and serpent, symbol of violence held in check by restraint. The decision settled into her chest like something familiar and heavy, for Rowan, for her father, for every woman who would step onto this grinder after her. The summons came at 0415. Mara was awake before the knock. She hadn't slept deeply since Syria, and she was dressed within 60 seconds. Chief Nolan Kerr stood in the doorway with a clipboard and a flashlight. He informed her that Senior Chief Kane had arranged a supplemental assessment at 0430. He claimed command had authorized her participation as part of the integration evaluation. He told her she had 15 minutes to report in PT gear. The authorization was almost certainly forged, but Mara had expected this. When she reached the grinder, portable floodlights bathed the concrete in harsh white glare. The candidates had been dragged from their barracks and stood trembling in formation, exhausted, confused, and unaware of why they'd been summoned at this hour. The candidates had been given no explanation for why they'd been dragged out here. Kane stood at the center of the grinder with Chief Nolan Kerr and PO1 Jace Rowan on either side, and nearly a dozen more instructors ringed the concrete, far more than any normal evolution required. Commander Julian Reddick was conspicuously absent. Kane waited until Mara took her place, then started speaking. He declared that Naval Special Warfare Command had requested a hands-on evaluation of their integration advisor's abilities. He claimed he had personally designed an assessment to determine whether she possessed the physical and professional credibility to advise on SEAL training. And he announced that she would complete this evaluation in full view of the candidates. The assessment had 3 phases. Phase 1, an 800-meter ocean swim in open water, wearing boots and utility trousers, with a water temperature hovering at 57 degrees. Standard time was 18 minutes, her time limit would be 14. Phase 2, a loaded movement, 50 pounds in a ruck carried 1.5 miles through soft sand. Standard time was 28 minutes, she would get 22. Phase 3, a combatives test. 2 back-to-back bouts against qualified instructor-level opponents, full contact, no time limit, victory by submission or referee stoppage only. Kane delivered the final details with a satisfaction he didn't bother hiding. Failure in any phase, he said, meant she would be removed from the observation program immediately. Refusal to participate would be logged as proof that women lacked the commitment necessary for special operations advisory roles. 173 candidates watched without a word. Mara looked at Kane. Then at the ocean, dark, frigid, and waiting. Then at the young men staring at her, silently weighing whether she would stand her ground. She told him she accepted. The swim started at 0437. The water was viciously cold, cold enough to punch the breath out of her chest, cold enough to make every stroke feel like shoving through wet concrete. Mara hit the surf without hesitation, settling into long, efficient strokes that saved energy while keeping her speed up. From the beach, the candidates watched her silhouette shrink into the pre-dawn black. Many of them had nearly failed this exact swim. They knew what cold water did to muscles, lungs, and the mind. She staggered out of the waves at 0449, 12 minutes and 31 seconds. Almost 90 seconds under Kane's reduced standard. Her skin was grayish-blue, her limbs shaking with involuntary tremors, but she didn't pause. She went straight to the ruck station. She threw the 50-pound pack onto her shoulders and started the sand carry. Soft sand was engineered to break people. Every step dragged at her legs. The weight on her back tried to shove her into the ground. Her soaked clothes added extra pounds of resistance. Her muscles burned. Halfway through, something none of the instructors expected happened. Petty Officer 3rd Class Daniel Okoro stepped out of formation. He was 23, a former collegiate wrestler from Houston, and he'd been watching Mara's performance with growing respect. Daniel Okoro jogged up beside her and fell into pace without saying a word. Kane roared at him to get back into formation, but Okoro kept moving. Within a minute, 4 more candidates stepped out. Then 9. Then 17. By the time Mara finished the carry at 0508, 19 minutes and 43 seconds, more than 2 minutes under Kane's adjusted standard, 26 candidates were walking beside her through the sand. Not one of them spoke. Kane's face drained of color. He had counted on her failing. He had counted on the candidates witnessing that failure. Instead, they'd watched her dominate the standard, and then they made a choice that cut directly against everything he believed. Phase 3 began at 0520. The combatives' pit was a roped-off square of hardened sand near the grinder. Kerr and Rowan would be her opponents. Both were seasoned fighters. Both outweighed her by at least 60 pounds. Kane read the rules aloud: full contact, no strikes to the throat or groin, win by submission, verbal tap, or referee stoppage. Medics waited at the edge of the sand. Nolan Kerr stepped into the pit first. 6 feet tall, 205, he moved with the relaxed certainty of a man who had never tasted defeat against someone this much smaller. Mara entered and settled into a stance that made several candidates lean forward. It wasn't standard Navy combatives. It blended wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and something else, joint manipulation built purely for efficiency over strength. Kerr lunged with an overhand right meant to end it fast. Mara wasn't there. She slipped left, caught his wrist and elbow, and rotated her hips, funneling all his momentum into a brutal spiral. His elbow bent past the point the human body was meant to endure. The joint didn't break, but the ligament damage was instant and severe. Kerr screamed, dropped to his knees, and slapped the sand in a frantic tap. 6 seconds. Mara released him and stepped back, her breathing only slightly elevated, her expression unchanged. Jace Rowan entered next, fury in his eyes. Bigger than Kerr at 6'2" and 220, he had no intention of repeating the same mistake. He circled her carefully, testing her reactions with sharp feints. He was cautious, and smart. Mara waited. Rowan shot forward for a double-leg takedown, dropping levels to get under her center of gravity. The technique was solid, timed perfectly. Mara sprawled, hips slamming down, weight driving back as his momentum stalled. She secured an overhook on his right arm, turned her body, and used his forward pressure to yank him off balance. Before he could reset, she'd already taken his back. Her legs locked around his hips. Her right arm slid under his chin. The rear naked choke was flawless, pressure on the carotids, not the airway, shutting down blood flow instead of oxygen. Rowan fought for 9 seconds before his body went slack. She released him instantly. Medics rushed in to check his vitals. Both fights combined had lasted under 40 seconds. 173 candidates stood frozen. Kane stared at the aftermath. Kerr cradled his ruined elbow. Rowan sat up slowly, dazed and trying to understand how he'd been dismantled so fast. And the woman who had just dismantled both men now stood in the center of the pit with her arms relaxed at her sides, simply waiting. Something cracked behind Kane's stare, something deep, structural. And then Senior Chief Braddock Kane made the gravest mistake of his career. He stepped into the pit. His voice dropped low, almost casual, yet every person on the grinder heard him clearly. He told her he knew exactly what she was doing. He said he'd spent his entire adult life defending the standards that kept SEALs alive. He insisted no Pentagon memo, no command initiative, no impressive performance would ever change what he called the unchangeable truth, that women had no place in naval special warfare. Then he grabbed her shoulder. His voice tightened to a whisper as he told her she would drop to her knees and apologize to the candidates for wasting their time. She would show them what happened when someone without a trident imagined she belonged here. He started to force her downward. What followed was witnessed by 173 candidates, 14 instructors, 2 corpsmen, and Commander Julian Reddick, who had arrived 6 minutes earlier and had been watching from the shadows of the HQ overhang. Mara didn't resist Kane's grip. She let him push her toward the ground. And then, at the exact instant his weight shifted too far forward, when his balance tipped past recovery, she moved. Her right hand twisted his wrist outward while her left drove into his solar plexus with enough force to rip the air from his lungs. As he folded, choking for breath, she pivoted behind him, swept out his lead leg, and slammed him face first into the sand. Before he could recover, she trapped his right leg in a position that made every instructor on the perimeter flinch. A heel hook, applied with rotational torque the human knee was never meant to endure. Cain screamed, an animal sound torn straight from instinct. His fingers clawed through the sand as he tried to escape, but her position was flawless, her leverage undeniable. She applied pressure slowly, deliberately, giving him a moment to understand exactly what was happening. Something in his knee ruptured with a sickening snap, like soaked rope tearing apart. His ACL was gone. His MCL tore a second later. Mara released him and rose. Cain writhed in the sand, clutching what remained of his knee, emitting sounds that no longer formed words. Kerr still held his destroyed elbow. Rowan sat dazed, stunned by what he'd just watched. Commander Reddick stepped out from the shadows and walked onto the grinder, his face carved from granite. He told them all they had just witnessed something beyond their experience. He told them the woman before them was not an administrative liaison, not a policy figure. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Mara Kelton. She was a graduate of a classified joint service program assessing female personnel for direct action support roles alongside Tier 1 units. Her service record included deployments buried under the highest levels of national security classification. She had earned the Bronze Star with Valor during a personnel recovery mission in Kunar province and bore shrapnel scars from a mission in Syria that would never appear in any official history. And then he said she had been sent to Redwater Bay not just to observe protocol, but to prove, beyond argument, that naval special warfare's definition of capability was overdue for expansion. The silence that followed was absolute. All 173 candidates stared at Mara Kelton, and the instructors who had come expecting to watch her humiliation stood frozen in place, their expressions showing the collapse of beliefs they had never once questioned. Senior Chief Braddock Cain lay in the sand, his ruined knee swelling by the second, his career ending at the precise moment his convictions finally shattered. Commander Julian Reddick stepped close to Mara and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. He told her Rowan Vance would have been proud. Something shifted inside her chest. The weight she had carried for 6 long years, the weight of Rowan's death, the burden of her unseen service, the strain of being exceptional in a world that demanded she stay invisible, began, at last, to lift. 8 weeks later, Mara stood on the grinder at 0530, watching the sun rise over Redwater Bay. Senior Chief Cain had been medically separated from the Navy after a board recorded his injuries and a command investigation recorded his actions. Chief Nolan Kerr had been reassigned to a training support role in Mississippi. PO-1 Jace Rowan requested a fleet billet. The official findings used phrases like, conduct unbecoming, and, abuse of authority. The unofficial understanding whispered by those who had witnessed that morning was simpler. They had made assumptions about someone they should never have underestimated, and those assumptions cost them everything. Mara accepted a permanent position as senior advisor for the Naval Special Warfare Integration Development Program. Her first mission was building evaluation criteria for the new support roles that would finally bring women into the special operations community, not as SEALs, but as specialists filling capabilities the teams had long lacked. During a recovery run on the beach, Petty Officer 3rd Class Daniel Okoro approached her. He was 3 weeks away from finishing Phase 1 and on track for the diving phase. He told her that what he had seen that morning had completely changed how he viewed capability. He admitted he'd once believed excellence came in only one shape. Now he knew he had been wrong. Mara told him the teams would need officers who understood that truth. She told him his generation would be the ones to carry it forward. Then she walked back to the grinder and stood alone on the concrete where everything had shifted. The sun climbed higher, burning away the remnants of lingering fog. She touched the tattoo on her forearm, the balance scale coiled with the serpent, and thought of Rowan Vance, of her father in the Kentucky hills, and of every woman who would step onto this concrete after her. Then she turned and walked toward the future she had helped carve into existence.